All right, everyone. Welcome to our first What's Next meeting of the summer. These will be virtually banked on a platform such as YouTube. The details are to be finalized, but they will be available to everyone in the club at some point in the fall. I want to thank everyone in advance for joining us, and I also want to thank our speaker today, Mr. Bill Lucas, for joining us. He has an incredible story, and we're really excited to hear from him. Mr. Lucas grew up in Greensboro, North Carolina, before attending Woodberry Forest. He was a Morehead Scholar at the University of North Carolina. After his time in Chapel Hill, Mr. Lucas served the U.S. State Department dutifully for 33 years, and that work included traveling to places such as Belgium and Afghanistan while also working for the National Security Council in Africa. He then joined the Diplomat and Residence Program at both the University of North Carolina as well as Duke University, and we are so grateful that he is taking time out of his day to come talk to us. So, Mr. Lucas, welcome, and thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here, Clayton.
All right, so we're just going to jump right into these questions. Unfortunately, since it is the summer and a pandemic, we have limited Q&A after my questions, but I'm sure that people will have questions for me after, so I can always email those to you at a later date and get a response if that works. So
Sure, that's fine.
my first question of the day is, can you just tell us a little bit about your background, high school interests, college major, potentially State Department work, and your career after the State Department?
Yeah, absolutely. So Clayton, like you and probably most of your listeners, I come from a deeply Southern family background. Our family comes out of South Carolina in the late 1700s. By the time I came along, the family had migrated up to Greensboro, North Carolina, where I went to public school. And as you mentioned, because my father before me and my older brother before me went off to Woodberry, I was also shipped off to Woodberry Forest and attended UNC as an English major, graduated from Chapel Hill with really not a very clear idea at all about what I wanted to do long term. A lot of my friends at that time were considering law school. In fact, two of my best friends and my older brother decided to go to law school, but I knew somehow instinctively that law school was not for me. But one thing I did know is after all those years of school, I was really ready for an adventure, and I really wanted to get out and see the world. And so a friend and I carried backpacks and motorcycled through Africa for a year. And it was that experience that really kind of lit a fire in me and gave me some direction in what I wanted to do professionally. I found that living abroad and meeting foreign people and learning new languages and learning about new cultures was something that was endlessly fascinating. So when I returned from Africa, I did a master's program in international studies and went to work for the State Department Foreign Service. And the Foreign Service is a business that staffs our embassies abroad. So over the course of a career, you could expect to spend about half your time living abroad, working in a US embassy, and half of your time back in Washington, D.C. at the main office.
Fascinating.
And again, I found that that was endlessly fascinating for 33 years. I should also add that my college experience was at the time of the Vietnam War protests. And I think that made a big impression on all of us that were in school at that time. And I came away with a feeling that surely there must be a better way to manage our international affairs than what we were seeing in connection with the Vietnam War. So when I developed this interest in international affairs, it was with the hope that maybe our generation could do one better than what we were seeing around us.
That's great. And you mentioned your experience at Carolina. I was reading up and I saw that when you said looking back at your time as a student at North Carolina, one thing you said in particular that sticks out was the experience of living with an Egyptian graduate student in an international dorm. How did that experience kind of shape your interest in foreign diplomacy? Because I know you mentioned that it was your real first kind of perspective worldwide. Did that alter at all? Did that kind of lead you to potentially seeing this as a future field for yourself?
It's interesting. It was not the spark that I received when I was traveling through Africa, but it was a very positive experience. And it was the very first time that I had been exposed to, a foreigner from a foreign culture. Of course, he was Muslim. He spoke Arabic. In fact, his English wasn't even that good, so I can't say that we developed a close relationship, but we had a very congenial relationship, and he was very thoughtful, very polite. And so the experience was a positive one. And I think it was the kind of thing, it was permissive in terms of when I begun to consider my line of work. That was a positive influence in my decision making.
And since you say it was such a positive experience, I'm sure as you look back on that year, you think this really helped me going forward in how to talk to people from different cultures, and maybe they don't have the best English, which I'm sure you dealt with a lot as you were traveling abroad later. So I'm sure that was kind of a good stepping stone as to what you did.
Absolutely, and I might just say that life is a series of unexpected and unanticipated events. I ended up with this Egyptian roommate completely by coincidence, in the sense that my roommate and I were first assigned to a dorm on freshman year on South Campus, which was kind of a hike up to main campus and a little bit out of the main flow of events on the campus. So we were interested in getting up on main campus, and we heard that the international dorm was looking for American students to pair up with foreign students. So we signed up for the program. I ended up with this Egyptian roommate, and we got up to main campus. So my main objective was really beside the point. However, the experience turned out to be so positive and led to my thinking later on.
That's fantastic. What an experience. This is jumping ahead a little bit, and we are going to backtrack, but I figure it would be good to have some clarity on these things since the position titles are a little bit odd, and I'd never heard of it personally before research. So in my research, I saw that you held a position at North Carolina entitled Scholar in Residence and Diplomat in Residence at Duke University. What exactly did those jobs entail, and what does the title themselves mean?
Well, the State Department for many years has had a program called Diplomat in Residence, and about a dozen people in the Foreign Service are selected, and they're assigned to university campuses across the country. And we're spread out fairly evenly, and we're given a district or a region. So my region was North Carolina, South Carolina, and Virginia. And it so happens that I'm physically accredited to Duke University, where they had office space for me. And among my duties was to travel the district and go to various universities and colleges and talk to students about the Foreign Service and participate in other programs like the one we're doing right now. Because of my background at UNC, some of my contacts there, when they found that I was coming to the area, offered me a faculty apartment on one of the dorms on the campus. And since my wife had a job here in Washington, D.C., I was spending the week in Chapel Hill and Durham and coming back on the weekends. So it was a great deal to have a free place to stay while I was in Chapel Hill during the week. And because I was on the dorm, I was on the 5th floor of about an 8-story building, and they wanted to make sure that the students understood who this old guy was. So they had a bulletin board in the lobby of the dorm explaining that I was the scholar in residence, and they had my picture there.
Interesting. So they knew you weren't the guy wandering the halls.
It was very funny because, of course, I had to take the elevator up and down. And as I was waiting for the elevator, I could hear all the students and all the noise, and the doors would open, and I'd step in, and everything would go quiet until we got down to the ground floor and everybody left. So, yeah, it was a little confusing, I think, at first for the students on who this guy was. But my duty in return for the free place to stay on the dorm was I ran a little program on Thursday evenings where I would show a video of some international issue, and then we would eat pizza and discuss it based on some of the experiences that I had had in my foreign service career.
That sounds so cool.
And then very, very fortunately, they asked me to teach a course. So I taught a course to seniors who were majoring in international studies. And, you know, for a former student then to go back to your home campus where I had so many great memories and then teach to some of the students was really a gift that I'll always cherish.
And it must have been so cool being able to teach those specific kids because I'm sure, I mean, Carolina gives a great education, and I'm sure those kids in that program were really kind of knowledgeable about what was happening with regards to foreign policy. So I'm sure that was probably a really awesome course to teach. And I want to jump back a little bit. This isn't in the written questions. I'm just actually curious for myself. I want to jump back to your time at Carolina because you said you majored in English. Is this program specific to a major? Because it seems like these kids already take interest in foreign policy. So I have kind of two questions. One is, what prompted you to go from an English major to traveling in Africa that year after college with your friend? And then do you wish that you had had availability to kind of a program like this so you could be involved in foreign policy when you were in college?
Yes, well, the decision to major in English was really sort of a process of elimination. There were, in many of the majors that I looked at carefully, there were course requirements that would have taken me in directions I was quite sure I did not want to go. And the English major, again, by process of elimination, simply had fewer course requirements that I did not want to take. So, and as I mentioned to you, it didn't lead me in any particular direction professionally. In retrospect, I wish that I might have developed my interest in foreign affairs earlier so I could have taken courses that were more designed for that kind of a background. But as it was, I was taking basically what I wanted to without a clear idea of where it would lead me.
I see. That makes complete sense. So it was a little bit of, I don't want to do this, I don't want to do this. And then it worked so well, that process, that you're like, oh, I really like doing this. And that's kind of.
Well, exactly. And then my friend and I, the friend that I went to Africa with was also an English major, also had very little idea of what he wanted to do. He's one of the ones who ended up going to law school. But we sort of jointly decided after graduation that we wanted to do an adventure. We wanted to get abroad and see the world. And so he and I made this plan and spent a year traveling around Africa.
That's great.
And as I say, that's what triggered my interest in international affairs.
Wonderful. So I know when we talked yesterday, you explained to me kind of the process, and we can get more into this when I ask you about students like me that are potentially interested in this field, but it might be good to give a little background on that now. So my next question is, in Afghanistan, you led a civilian military team to promote rule of law. Can you tell us about that experience? And maybe before you get into that, just kind of mention how you went from traveling in Africa to passing that exam that you have to pass to become involved with the State Department, and just how you got to Afghanistan.
Yeah, okay. Well, you enter the Foreign Service first and foremost by taking a standardized written test. And once you pass that, then there are a number of forms that you fill out and essays that they ask you to write. Then based on that information, you may or may not be asked in for an interview, a face-to-face interview. And depending on how the interview goes, then you may or may not be offered a position. And so that's in a nutshell, how you come into the Foreign Service. then during the course of a career in the Foreign Service, you spend maybe half of your time working abroad in various countries and half of your time in the main office at the State Department. And people do their fair share. That's actually the term of art. But people are asked to do their fair share in hardship posts. So a person cannot go through their entire career going to Western European capitals, London, Paris, Rome. You can do some of that, but at some point you're asked then to go to a hardship post as well. In recent years, most of us have also been asked to go to a conflict zone. And I would say that by now, the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq have been going on for so long now. I'm willing to bet that 75% of Foreign Service officers have served now, not only in a hardship post, but in a conflict zone. And that was the case for me. It was one of my last assignments in the Foreign Service. It was my time, it was my turn to go to a conflict area. And at that time, the US government had sent tens of thousands of new troops to Afghanistan to deal with the war there. And as a result, there had to be a similar uptick in the civilian population, in the civilian contingent of the US government. And that's where I came in. I was assigned to Afghanistan as a civilian, and my job was to help establish rule of law in areas of the country that had been liberated from the Taliban. So the military's strategy in Afghanistan was clear, hold, and build. So obviously the military has to clear an area of enemy forces of the Taliban. They have to hold the area and make it secure. And then the idea was to build local government infrastructure, and that is a civilian task. So once the area is clear and held from Taliban, then we came in and working with the Taliban government to establish a functioning police, a functioning court system, and a functioning prison system.
And it says it all in the rule of law. That makes complete sense.
Rule of law. And obviously, there are various agencies in the US government that can assist with this. Some of the military commands were capable of building stuff. So we were building courthouses, we were building prisons, or at least refurbishing prisons. We were training judges, we were training prosecutors, all in an attempt to get civilian operations going in areas that had been liberated.
I see. So you say it is a civilian military team. So am I correct to assume that your previous job in the government not only included diplomacy, but also military related work?
Well, actually, I had never really had much of an exposure to the military side of things. Because I'd always been posted in peaceful areas like Belgium, like South Africa, like Philippines. And although there would be a military office in the embassy, but there weren't that many joint efforts in peaceful countries. The military was doing their thing with the military of the host government. I was doing my thing with civilian agencies in the host government. But Afghanistan was totally unique in that it was a combat zone. The military had most of the resources. The military had so many more people than we did on the civilian side, and they basically had the lead, and we were trying to fill in and fill the gaps.
Gotcha. And so that's really interesting that it was unique in that you hadn't done that before. How did you train and make the transition from, just diplomacy to working with more militaristic efforts? And which did you prioritize when you were in Afghanistan? Because you mentioned it was threefold, and the last step, maybe the most important one of all, was building a new infrastructure. So you kind of had to use both in a sense there. Which did you prioritize when you were in Afghanistan, and how did you train for that transition?
Well, the Foreign Service has wonderful training programs. And I should mention that they have a language school that will teach you languages in all of the countries where you might be assigned. That's not to say that everyone in the embassy in a country receives the training, but for those people who are going to have a lot of contact with the local officials, they will get the training. There's also area studies training. And so I was not trained in the Afghan language, but I did get several months of training about Afghan history, Afghan culture, and that was a good preparation for going there. Also, you know, on your own free time, most of us would pick up books and start reading about Afghanistan and reading about the region. Now, when I arrived in Afghanistan, the embassy had already had such an influx of civilian Foreign Service personnel that the only place they could house me and my team was on a military base. So I was actually living on a military base on the outskirts of Kabul, the capital.
Wow.
And 80%, 90% of the people around me were military people in their fatigues, carrying a weapon at all times. And every morning in the morning briefings, I was surrounded by military officers who, by the way, were extremely impressive individuals. Again, I had not had that much exposure to our military, but I have to say I came away very, very impressed with the quality of the individuals that I was dealing with, all the way up to the commanding officer who was a Navy SEAL in his early 50s, a three-star admiral who was still doing the SEAL workout
Wow.
3 times a week.
Oh my gosh. That is brutal. What an experience.
If you know the character called Mr. Clean on the advertisements, he looked like Mr. Clean. He was completely bald.
Oh,
His
so
shape was like
he fits the picture of a Navy SEAL, just a big guy.
it was incredible. He would take the youngest, fittest soldier and challenge him to a workout and smoke him every time.
Oh my gosh.
So I had a really positive experience with our military.
That's great. So you mentioned that they had a program. This is another not written question, but I'm fascinated by this. You said that in the training program they can teach you a wide variety of languages. How many languages can you speak?
Well, I learned French and Afrikaans. French to go to Brussels, where that's one of the predominant languages, and Afrikaans for South Africa, about 60% of the white population, and then several million people in the so-called colored population speak Afrikaans as a first language. Now, don't test me on that because that was 30 years ago. So
We'll stick to English on this interview.
That's good.
Yeah. So you mentioned Brussels. We're actually about to get into that now. It looks like you did spend some time in Belgium working with the European Union, as well as serving on the National Security Council in Africa while stationed in DC. Can you tell us about that? And obviously it differed greatly from your time in Afghanistan, but what different lessons did you take from the different places you went?
Yeah. Well, Brussels was particularly interested because I was not assigned in our embassy per se. I was assigned to our mission to the European Union. So there was an embassy next door that was accredited to the Belgian government and would deal with issues that came up between our two countries. But our mission was dealing with issues that came up between the United States and the European Union. And those were very, very many. The European Union started out as a trade organization, So we had many, many trade issues with the European Union, but over time, the EU became more and more of a political institution and dealt more and more with foreign policy issues for the 27 members of the European Union. So we were dealing not just with trade issues, but also with foreign policy issues with the European Union. My takeaway from that experience was the value of the European Union as an institution and of NATO, which was kind of a counterpart to the EU dealing with military issues, and the value of that for European stability and peace. We all know that World War I and World War II started as wars between European countries. And the purpose of the EU and NATO is to integrate those countries so that war between them would be unthinkable. And they've done a really good job at that. There's been peace in Europe now for 70 years. At the National Security Council now, that's back in Washington, D.C. The National Security Council is next door to the White House. We provide support to the president and to senior White House officials on foreign policy issues. So whether it's the president's correspondence or his meetings with foreign officials or his foreign travel or any of the foreign policy issues that, the Department of State wants the president's decision, or the Department of Defense or the intelligence agencies, the National Security Council is the one who provides, let's call it, the staff work for that.
Gotcha.
And so it's a wonderful vantage point to observe how our government functions sort of from the top. Oftentimes the various departments are in conflict about what the next step should be in our policy. And the National Security Council is responsible for developing the options and placing the decision before the president so that he can make a choice.
So which president did you work for?
So I worked for George W. Bush and was in the Oval Office with him only a few times, but appreciated his efficiency. He was a stickler for timeliness. He ran a very orderly operation, which apparently was in contrast to Bill Clinton, President Clinton, who was much more sort of laissez-faire and take it as it comes. And I was dealing with Africa, and and President Bush had some wonderful programs that he initiated with Africa. So it was a very positive experience. But it was what we call I was simply assigned to the NSC for 1 year at the State Department. Most of the people working at the NSC are housed in government departments, and they're sent on loan to the NSC and then returned back to their home department.
Makes sense. One last question just about kind of your abroad travel. You said, what was the term you used earlier? Your fair share?
Yes, fair share.
So, did you choose all of these different places to go, or did the State Department kind of assign where you went? Because I know you obviously had to complete your fair share, but did you choose to go to Afghanistan while also Brussels, or did the State Department say, we want you here, we want you here?
So the way that works is there's a bidding process where you are required, when your assignment is coming up, when your reassignment is coming up, you are required to submit a bid list where you put down 8 places, 8 assignments that you would be interested in receiving, a minimum of 8 and a maximum of 15. And then the system, receiving all of this information from all of the people who are up for reassignment, they try to get you to your first, second, or third choices but at least get you to one of those places on your bid list.
Interesting.
If for some reason that's impossible, they call you in, you have a consultation, and you agree on a place to go. But the fair share requirement says that every 8 years of overseas work, you must be in a fair share post. So you have to include those on your bid list.
Interesting.
If you don't, you're called in and you have a consultation. So it's a negotiation.
Wow, that's a really cool way to do it. Seems like probably the most fair way to do it, and you get probably your most desirable places a good amount of the time. So that's
a good amount of the time. Exactly. Yeah.
So now we're kind of shifting gears a little bit. I really loved hearing about what you have to do, but now I kind of want your advice for high school kids and even maybe some college kids who, are interested in potentially joining the State Department. And I know there are a diverse range of professions within the State Department. If a student in this club were interested in joining the State Department, which specific jobs do you feel are worth exploring, and what classes, activities should the students pursue in high school or college if this field interests them?
Good question. The State Department has 5 career tracks. And when you take that standardized written test, they will ask you which of the 5 you are interested in pursuing. And they're really quite different. And there's a very good website that is available to everyone to go on, and you can learn more about these different career tracks. But very briefly, I'll start with the most obvious, the administrative track. So these are the people in the State Department who make the organization function. We're talking budgets, personnel. When you're overseas, we're talking housing, carpool, motor pool, those sorts of very practical duties that allow the operation to go forward. A second track would be your consular officials. Consular officials deal with visas, passports, and American citizens. So if you're traveling abroad and you have a problem and you go into an embassy for help, you'll be speaking to a consular officer. A third track is public affairs. These are the people who deal with the media, with the press. They write speeches for the ambassador and other senior officials in the embassy. They do outreach programs in the local community. They run the exchange programs that we have where we send Fulbright scholars to that country or send scholars from their country to the United States. So that's public affairs. And then fourth, there is the economic officer. They deal with U.S. reports that go back to Washington, and U.S. business people will study those reports to make their decisions.
Mr. Lucas, sorry to interrupt. We cut out a little bit, probably 20 seconds or so. Can you explain the third field again?
So the economic officer, is that where I was when
Yes,
we
sir.
cut off?
Yes, sir.
The economic officer deals with U.S. business and helping U.S. business get established in the foreign country. And they also report on economic conditions in the host country for use by U.S. business people. And then finally, there's the political officer. And this is the traditional diplomatic work that you probably think of first when you consider what diplomacy is all about. And that is when issues come up between our country and their country, you go in and speak to their resolve issues. The classic case is if there's
Alrighty, that is unfortunate. I believe he disconnected.
Oh, we're back.
We're back.
Okay, you know, I'm going to move a little bit closer to our router.
That sounds great.
See
It
if
was
that makes-
working perfectly, and then for some reason in that last description, it just kind of completely blurred out. But that is what virtual looks like, so no worries at all.
it might have a like a blurring function on it, and that was just getting a little too boring.
I was fascinated. I want to hear that description of the last one you were talking about again.
Okay, well, the last one was the okay, you've cut out again. Hold on.
I can hear you perfectly. Can you hear me?
Oh, okay. Yes, I can now. So I was saying that the political officer is the one that is probably what immediately comes to mind when you think of diplomacy. And that is the people who go into host government officials and try to deal with issues that come up between the two countries. So the classic example is, let's say there's a vote at the United Nations, and we've decided how we want to vote. We go in and we marshal our arguments to the host government and try to convince them to vote the same way.
I see.
So that's just one example of the kinds of issues that you would go in and deal with the foreign officials.
And I think it's so special that in the State Department, like it's not just, you know, typically when I would think of the State Department, I think about what you just described, like going internationally, kind of settling disputes and or convincing them to vote the same way as you. But I also think it's really cool that, you know, you need the people who are really good with visas. You need the people who are really good at economics and balancing bills and stuff like that. I just think that it's such a diverse kind of field that there are so many options that can apply to so many people who want to be involved with the U.S. government. So I think it's really unique in that way.
That's very true. I will say that in order to pass the Foreign Service exam, which is the first hurdle, there's a heavy emphasis, of course, on foreign policy issues, on international affairs, even some economics. So if you were wanting to design your, say, your college major in order to prepare for this career, I would definitely recommend things like international affairs, political science, history, economics, those sorts of things.
That's great advice.
Then
Thank you.
pass the test, you come in and you can do any of the 5 functions.
That's perfect. I'm sure that's very valuable information. So again, kind of shifting gears again, I know we're kind of doing that a lot, but I want to hear your kind of how this shaped your worldview. So how have your international experiences shaped your views on government and human nature as a whole?
Yeah, well, okay. Well, I'll just say that before I ever went abroad, the world outside the United States was like a black box. It was impossible to see into it. It was impossible to understand how foreign countries functioned, how they reacted to what we were doing in the United States, what effect that our policies were having on them. When I traveled to Africa after college, the first thing that struck me was how similar the rest of the world was. on a very superficial level, I found that, societies are very similar, that human beings are the same around the world in many respects. Then, as I spent more time abroad, I began to see the nuances. I began to see the unique aspects of each country and their historical development and their particular concerns. And I began to appreciate how they viewed the United States and how our actions in the world affected them. And I found that fascinating. And so rich and so diverse and endlessly fascinating. So I guess one of my takeaways was that in many respects, people are the same around the world. But in another sense, each country is very, very unique. And another takeaway that I had was, and you can question this in these days, but I've always noticed that the United States has a special capability to recognize the problems that we have internally and really set our minds to resolving those issues. Now, you and I know that Washington hasn't functioned very well for many, many years. The Congress is gridlocked. There's a lot of wheel spinning in Washington, but compared to other countries, historically, the United States has always been relatively good at identifying problems and working very hard to solve those problems.
Right.
I still think that's one of our strengths if we can just get back to it.
I completely agree. So I know that you had 3 kids, and I'm sure there are benefits and challenges to managing a family in a foreign country. Did your children benefit from being abroad as much as you did, and what lessons did they take while with you?
Well, the first thing that a Foreign Service kid has to learn is to be adaptable to new circumstances and to be able to fit in and make friends in a new environment. So I think that's a lasting capability that our kids and other Foreign Service kids have developed. Also, the world to them is not a strange and forbidding place. The world is an inviting and interesting place for them, I think, and other Foreign Service kids. So that I often say that if our kids were presented with an opportunity that involved going overseas or living overseas, they would not be deterred at all from taking that opportunity.
I'm sure they would not. Just the worldwide view and experiences of that, I'm sure, are kind of priceless.
Exactly. An understanding that I only got after college when I started going abroad, to understand that, the world out there is manageable. It's a place that offers a lot of opportunities and a lot of interesting experiences.
And even if it's not abroad, I feel like what the quality of adaptability that you mentioned previously is so important to any circumstance, because whether you're starting a new job and you're having to communicate with colleagues or bosses, I think that's a skill that runs not only abroad, but in everyone's life. Just being able to talk to other people and be adaptable, I think, is a huge life skill. So I'm sure that they're very talented in that.
Well, I'll let them speak to that, but I think that is something that you get exposed to as a Foreign Service kid.
I'm sure. So now I just want your thoughts on a current issue that I've talked a lot with people in my family about, and I'm very curious on an expert's thoughts. When you were coming along, obviously the Soviet Union posed a major threat to the United States. How do you feel about our current relationship with China and how that could continue to evolve, what we could do better, et cetera?
Yeah, well, China, you're right to compare the two. China is going to be the biggest challenge for our 21st century, in the same way that the Soviet Union was for this second half of the 20th century. And historically, we know that when there's an established superpower that is confronted by an emerging power, that it can often lead to conflict.
No
And
doubt.
we only have to point to the First and the Second World War,
Right.
where in the case of the Second World War, it was Germany and Japan that were emerging powers. And that didn't unfold very well. So knowing that, we need to put our minds to making sure that the same thing doesn't happen with regard to the rise of China. And it requires being smart, and it's important to develop coalitions of like-minded countries, not going it alone. It involves understanding where the other country is coming from and avoiding needless provocations that can lead to conflict. Um, it involves speaking quietly behind the scenes to the emerging power to agree on how we're going to manage our relations, not shouting from the rooftops about the problems that we're having. Uh,
Absolutely.
the way we used to frame it with the Soviet Union was, and today even with Russia, is that we cooperate where we can and we confront where we must. And that to me is a very good formula for China.
I completely agree. I think that you have to be peaceful first, but there comes a time when there might need to be, a confrontation, as you said. It can't always be agreement. So sure there will be
Exactly.
disputes, but I think that that's great advice.
And when it comes to confrontation, and I'm not speaking now just about military
Right,
confrontation,
right,
but
right.
when we have to go to the mat with another country, it helps to have our allies lined up behind us. And that's where diplomacy comes in.
That's great. I mean, do you have any other thoughts on that? That kind of concludes, but I have one more question for you, but it's not at all related to anything that we've talked about. So do you have any other thoughts on any of this that we've talked about before I move on to that?
No, well, I would just say that I hope all of your colleagues will look seriously at public service as a profession. They always say it's not going to be the biggest moneymaker out there, but there's a special reward, I think, from public service and from serving your country that all of us who join the Foreign Service share. I will say that the State Department in particular takes very good care of their employees. We go abroad, they do a wonderful job of trying to take care of you and your family, trying to make sure that you're protected. Even in a combat zone, there are lots of precautions that are taken to make sure that you're not injured or disadvantaged. I mean, they don't want, in a combat zone, they don't want you killed any more than you want to stay
Right.
alive. It's not good for them either.
No, it's not.
So I would just encourage your colleagues to look seriously at public service. There are many different routes into the Foreign Service, as we've discussed, but certainly studying international affairs, foreign policy, history, those are very good things if you're serious about going that way.
And I think that anyone that watches this clip in its entirety will understand that there's so many benefits to being in the foreign service, especially if you have a skill set such as yourself. So yeah, I think it's a very valuable field, and we appreciate all of your work for the country. Um,
Absolutely.
my last question is: I know you attended Woodberry Forest, and the people that are going to be watching this went to St. Chris. So I have to ask on behalf of my school. I know you played football. What was your football record against us in your time as a varsity athlete?
Well, I played varsity junior and senior year. Junior year, we were undefeated.
That
So,
answers half the question right there. That's one win.
and senior year, I actually remember the game quite well. It was at St. Chris, and you guys were a strong, strong team. In fact, your fullback went on to play pro football.
Wow.
His name is Robert Pratt. I don't know if any of
That
you know him.
sounds familiar.
I think he still lives in Richmond. But we did. We came out ahead in that game. However, in basketball, you guys whooped up on us junior and senior year.
So it was even. You guys took football, we took basketball.
You took basketball, and apparently we split in baseball.
Okay, so pretty even. Pretty
Pretty
even.
even.
I'm just happy to say that our varsity team was able to reverse the losing trend to Woodberry this year. So shout out to all those guys that got the dub this year for us.
Congratulations.
All right, well, Mr. Lucas, that concludes my interview. I just want to thank you so much for joining us. I know that this is such an interesting topic, and I really hope that a ton of guys will tune in. But I had a great time talking to you, and so thankful that you gave up your time to not only talk to me today, but also kind of give these questions thoughtful responses in your time yesterday. So thank you.
It's been a great pleasure to be with you, Clayton, and I wish you the best of luck and all of your colleagues.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Have a good one. Bye-bye.
You bet. Thanks very much. I enjoyed it.
Bye.